these other countries in the ASEAN region are going to be massively impacted just because they don't have the same elements of economic stability or military capacity like India would. So from that standpoint, yes, it does offer opportunities for certain types of investment, certain sectors, and it offers market access, obviously, regionally. But from a bang for your buck standpoint, India is a better longer term investment due to macroeconomic and geopolitical trends.
Companies operating in today's global economy really need to get an understanding of the international geopolitical risk landscape. At Infortal Worldwide, we work with our clients on solving risk before it starts. Welcome to the Riskology podcast. This is a 5-part series on geopolitical risk intelligence, where we're looking at managing business risk globally and really understanding the geopolitical risk landscape.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Ian Oxnevad for our 5th and final episode in our series on geopolitical risks. And today we're going to take a look at China and Asia Pacific. Ian, first of all, welcome back.
Thank you.
Ian, the reopening of China sort of post-COVID in fits and starts has been a challenge for, frankly, the world's economy. But there are other risks with China that I think that any U.S. companies, if they're not thinking about, they need to start thinking about, as in yesterday. How do you help companies think through the risks, potential risk with China, from a shooting war to a political war to a trade war to just not enemies, but highly tuned competitors?
Of course. Well, it's convenient that Infortal Worldwide has a China escape plan package that we are developing. So this is very apropos. China, its response to COVID, it waged a people's war, or what it called a people's war against COVID, which created not only a public health challenge, but also a political one. You had some of the most extreme lockdowns in the world in China, and COVID deaths in China are uncertain, despite the official numbers. The official numbers are ridiculously small. More realistic estimates are at least around 2 million or so. There's been 900 million infections, according to the more reliable models as of early 2023, and that's the vast majority of the Chinese population at this point. Ultimately, that resulted in protests against the lockdowns in China, which, if you know anything about Chinese authoritarianism and how totalitarian the country is, there was a massive uptick in terms of resentment against the Chinese Communist Party and what was going on with the lockdowns. So they were forced to reopen as a result of internal political pressure. Meanwhile, you had Xi Jinping win a third term, which was sort of unprecedented as China's leader. And this reopening spiked inflation worldwide, right? Because as China reopened, energy consumption resumed, and this was largely due to oil consumption. That increased production costs globally. And as a result of this, that's affecting some of the inflation worldwide that we're seeing now. It's not the only cause, but it's one of them. China's foreign policy, however, despite its internal issues with state-owned enterprise debt and sort of lingering resentment over COVID, China's getting very aggressive in terms of its geopolitical outlook and its foreign policy. And this is something that American companies and others need to start thinking about, getting their assets out of China, nearshoring, ally shoring, or reshoring completely, nearshoring, to try to decouple from China. Because if war ensues, the massive instability that's going to come from that, you're going to be looking at companies scrambling to try to pull out of China all at once, and it may become unaffordable to relocate the supply chains if you wait until bullets start flying or potentially nuclear weapons. But East Asian growth has obviously been one of the largest drivers worldwide over the past 25 years, and this could all abruptly halt if China invades Taiwan and tries to reabsorb Taiwan by force. Beijing is making regular incursions into Taiwanese waterways and airspace over the Meridian Line. As of 2022, there's been over 1,700 incursions from different planes from China, from the PLA military and Chinese warplanes entering Taiwan airspace. And this makes war potentially possible overnight with no advanced warning. So the warnings are already there that this is occurring. There's also Chinese tensions with India and the Himalayas. There've actually been hand-to-hand battles, which haven't really made the news, between Indian troops and the Chinese military in the Himalayas around Ladakh. And this kind of goes back to a bigger issue with East Asia that nobody really talks about, is that China and India are massive competitors. And even before British colonization sort of changed India, the Qing dynasty was looking at invading India. And there's actually maps and historical documents examining this. And that's sort of, China has kind of a superiority complex vis-a-vis India related to this. And you see disputes over water and territory around the Himalayas. And U.S. military aid to Taiwan doesn't get a lot of attention, but it's now at $10 billion, or about $2 billion a year. So all the precursors for sort of World War I type scenario are there, where all it takes is one misstep for a massive war to occur involving China, whether or not it's simply confined to China and Taiwan, or whether or not Japan gets involved, or Australia, India gets involved on the side of Taiwan, or the U.S., or just sort of independently. And if Pakistan therefore gets involved because Chinese investment has sort of colonized Pakistan at this point, whether or not it takes China's side in a war, you're looking at a potentially massive war, World War III essentially, with nuclear weapons involved. And that's highly unstable. So all these tensions are taking place in terms of the Pacific Rim. There's reasons to think that India is not only an alternative source for investing rather than China. For example, you look at China just recently did sanctions against Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. China's instituting confiscatory fines now at this point on those companies for their civil business, on their civil business side, civil aviation side in China, because of the dealings that they have with Taiwan. Now, India's civil aviation market is largely unpenetrated still, and that provides just one case study of potential opening for U.S. companies to invest in India as opposed to China. It's still centrally located to East Asian markets and also the Middle East and Africa for that matter. It's got a large domestic market, and it doesn't have the same political issues that China does with the U.S.
What about what we used to call the Asian tigers? The smaller countries, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Malaysia, Indonesia, not as far as, but perhaps even down to New Guinea. What about those countries?
Those countries are kind of currently in the middle of a geopolitical tug of war between China and what you could call sort of a counter-China coalition. If you're looking at companies that are wanting to relocate from China, India is a better possibility for that, just because India has the capacity to not have its supply chain severed and has the capacity to defend itself. These other countries, if major war ensues with Taiwan or North Korea and the Korean Peninsula and China gets involved with that, that's another trigger point. These other countries in the ASEAN region are going to be massively impacted just because they don't have the same elements of economic stability or military capacity like India would. So from that standpoint, yes, it does offer opportunities for certain types of investment, certain sectors, and it offers market access, obviously, regionally. But from a bang for your buck standpoint, India is a better longer-term investment due to macroeconomic and geopolitical trends.
Although still monikered as the world's largest democracy, India has at least put tendencies in which suggest a move towards autocracy, or at least strongman rule. Do you see any risk in the political realm for India?
Not that's necessarily a standout case from the growing authoritarianism everywhere else all at the same time that we're seeing. No, India's got a lot of experience with democratic governance, even though it's got its massive internal issues and things like that related to corruption, other things, because it's still a developing country. Unlike China kind of pretends to be a developing country, India still is. And India's worked with parliamentary procedure. They were working on that decades before independence, going back 50, 60 years prior to independence. So they have the experience and sort of democratic mindset of rule of law and against autocracy. And India, because it's federal as well, there's a number of institutional safeguards in place that would protect some of those democratic aspects from getting taken over by sort of a strongman. I don't see that happening. It's possible. Anything is possible, but I don't necessarily see it as a standout risk from anywhere else in the world at the moment.
Do the potential risks in China warrant or at least provide an opportunity for U.S. companies to either nearshore or reshore in the United States? And if so, what's the government role in facilitating a U.S. reshoring effort in terms of tax incentives or outright grants or other types of incentives?
Well, from a nearshoring, friendshoring, or nearshoring standpoint, yes. Get out of China as fast as you can, if like I was pressed to offer an answer to that, simply because the risks are too great, right? If war takes place and the U.S. wins, your property and your stuff, your investments in China are still going to be confiscated, seized. If you try to keep your investments in China and there's a war and the U.S. loses, then you could wind up losing property rights as the result of instability here, depending on how the war plays out. But you also have other aspects of this too, where really it's kind of a no-win situation if you remain in China when there's safer alternatives. From the government standpoint in the U.S., that's a heavier question to answer because you're not just looking at national incentives, you're also looking at state incentives, local incentives, because unlike other parts of the world where it's more centralized, the U.S. has multiple layers of government that play a role in this that most other parts of the world don't necessarily have. So you have differing layers of incentives for nearshoring, and any of those things could happen where you see incentives from a taxation standpoint to nearshore, anywhere from government grants, whether you're looking at sort of national security, sort of Defense Production Act things related to pharmaceuticals. Most pharmaceuticals, a huge number of those come from China, and China, all it would have to do is cease the exporting of those materials for the pharmaceutical industry. And you're looking at massive deaths as a result of anything from, diabetes to cancer, other treatments that would just suddenly become unavailable. So for certain things like that, you may see national intervention from sort of a Defense Production Act standpoint to nearshore things very quickly. India has a large ability to manufacture pharmaceuticals, for example. So there could be bilateral trade things that take place that way. Any of those things could come into play. It really just depends on the company and the industry.
Does the potential opportunity in India, does that extend to Pakistan, or does the political situation and the geography of Pakistan make it really a different sort of can of worms?
It makes it a different can of worms, partly because Pakistan is much more authoritarian. You have a much longer system of authoritarian rule in Pakistan. It's highly unstable. You have jihadist groups present in Pakistan. You have China, which is heavily present in Pakistan to the extent that you could almost call Pakistan a colony of China, partly because if you're looking at Chinese overland routes to the Indian Ocean, which they can't directly access, Pakistan is that sort of corridor that allows them to reach from China itself to the Indian Ocean. And you have a lot of infrastructure projects going into Pakistan from China. So from that standpoint, you're looking at an extension of China. You're looking at authoritarian risks domestically and organic to the country itself. You're looking at terrorism risks. The risks are plentiful enough and interlocking enough that it's a completely different can of worms than India.
Well, Ian, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, and indeed the end of our time together for this series. I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me. It's been a great series. And let's end, if our listeners wanted any more information or perhaps even to follow up with you directly, what would be the best ways for them to do so?
Check out our website, Infortal Worldwide.
Ian, thanks so much, and I greatly look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you.